Hello, and welcome to the first Lunchtime Discovery Series talk for 2022. Happy New Year, everyone. I'm Jerry Reynolds, your guest host today. I'm head of outreach at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, and I'm delighted to host today's Lunchtime Discovery talk. The Lunchtime Discovery Series is organized by the North Carolina Office of Environmental Education within the Department of Environmental Quality, and it's broadcast by the Museum of Natural Sciences. We have a great presentation for you today. And remember, our program is interactive. Drop your thoughts and questions in the chat on YouTube and comments on Facebook as we go, and we'll answer all those after the talk. Chris Smith is with us today, but I actually asked to be guest host for today's topic. Our speaker today is Dr. Gary Freese, retired history professor from Catawba College in Salisbury. His specialty through the years has been North Carolina history, particularly the time when the state industrialized in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Dr. Freese is best known for his local heritage trilogy, The Catawbans, A History of Catawba County. He is the author of a middle school textbook on the state, North Carolina, Land of Contrast. And he also likes for people to know, tongue in jowl, so to speak, in his words, that he is the great explainer of the differences between the two principal types of North Carolina barbecue, a subject very dear to my heart and stomach. He has actually argued for years that the so-called Lexington-style barbecue is a ethnically based derivative of the original Goldsboro style of cooking and serving the proverbial pig. I know this was raising some eyebrows right now in our audience. His research shows that the West follows German traditions in its preparation and presentation, while the East sticks to English roots. Perhaps we could chew on this topic in another lunchtime talk, or at least at lunch. So anyway, back to today's topic. Dr. Freese shares a special affinity for today's topic. He is from the same town of the Wallace brothers, Statesville in Iredell County. And even as a teenager, he was aware of the contribution of the Wallace brothers to the local economy and the role that Jews played in the industrial development of the area. When he became a professor, he returned to that remarkable story and looked at records that hadn't been seen before. His work on the crude trade drug of the Gilded Age won him a National Business History Award in 1995. And he has reprised it often since, and today he'll be bringing us a mixture of local history, ethnographic analysis, ecological context, and the makings of one of North Carolina's most unusual stories. I also lived in Iredell County in Mooresville, just south of Statesville in the 1990s, and that is when I first heard Dr. Freese talk on this fascinating topic of North Carolina's history about the Wallace brothers and their herbarium. So Dr. Freese, I am so glad that you have joined us today. Welcome to the Lunchtime Discovery Series.
Thank you, Jerry. I am excited to give this talk. I want to warn everyone ahead of time that I had a non-COVID illness over Christmas and I still cough. So if you see me pop a cough drop into my mouth, just bear with me. I don't think I can give you cooties over the internet, at least yet. They haven't developed that technology. I want to reiterate how excited I always am to talk about this topic. It has been dear to me ever since I was young because it was one of the best stories of my locality. And I then later became a historian of localities like Salisbury, Statesville, particularly Hickory. And I tend to look at history from the inside out and the bottom up. And I tend to look at very particular things which help give us general understandings of the changes that have been part of our nation's past. So the Wallace brothers and their herbarium, or botanical depot, as we'll call it, is one of those stories that fits this. And I will say that this has brought me more return by far than the barbecue thesis. So we'll stand on very solid ground today in terms of what I'll be sharing with you. Jerry, if we'll put up the title page, I'll be ready for that. Jerry's going to be doing the slides because I cannot talk and do tech at the same time. We're up.
Just a minute, let me get to where I can advance slides. Hang on. Okay. Whoops, let me go back. Sorry.
No problem.
There we go. Sorry.
All right.
That's
Well,
my technical inability.
the title today is based upon the actual approach that I take to this topic, which is a local historian's take on both the community and the environment, and most particularly the people who are involved in both of those topics. And so what you see are the three basic things which the Wallace brothers collected and sold during the Gilded Age, the period after the American Civil War, and that is roots, that is the actual root systems of various plants, herbs, which of course are known to us all, berries, which is somewhat surprising in that they made a lot of money off something like blackberries. And as I will be talking about later in the talk, you will see that they were Jewish. And one of the distinctions of Statesville is that it had one of the strongest communities of Jewish people in the state after the Civil War, only exceeded, I think, by the Jewish community in Goldsboro. So the Wallaces were central both to their faith, to their business, and they had a great fidelity to their community. So Jerry, we'll go to the next one. Let's talk about what you're looking at now so you'll understand the topic in their words or their terms. This is a catalog from 1884. This is actually the best of the catalogs that we've been able to find from the business records which were left. Notice Wallace Brothers, Statesville, North Carolina, they are wholesale Southern herbalist. An herbalist was a very general term for people who practiced essentially what they also called back then the crude drug trade. By crude, they meant essentially it was like crude oil. It had come out of the ground and it had yet to be refined. And they essentially also called it the root trade, because every time you look at what they say, the first thing that they are actually selling is always roots. But you will notice that they say every variety of crude Southern roots, herbs, barks, flowers, seeds, mosses, and then they add underneath gums and berries. If it could be extracted naturally from the landscape of the Southern Appalachians, the Wallace brothers were very interested in both the viability of using these items and secondly, the idea that they could be marketed for a profit. All orders carefully and properly executed. Essentially, they promised and they delivered on what they promised because they were at their peak about 1884 to the late 1880s, the best known wholesale druggist, if you will, crude druggist, if you will, in the United States. And their fame extended beyond the United States into Europe as well. They had customers in England, they had customers in France, and they, in a sense, were at the peak of their trade. In fact, in 1884, if you had toured North Carolina and you had gone to some of the great highlights of North Carolina success stories, such as Bull Durham in Durham, you would have also beat a path to Statesville, as did numerous people who came to visit what they called their Botanic Depot, if anything, just to get a smell. So I'm going to read to you essentially what someone said in the 1880s so that you will understand it. Here's the quote. Statesville is known to the druggist of the country and of Europe as the place where more medicinal herbs are collected and prepared for the trade than any other place in the world. Now, there's a little bit of a problem to that statement, especially in today's world. When they were speaking, I suspect, about the Western Eurocentric world. My suspicion is that the volume of this business in Statesville, North Carolina, did not approach that of an average business in China or somewhere else in Asia that still practiced traditional medicine. So don't get the idea that this was a world, say a completely world-class place, but within the context of American business history, And within the context of American environmental history, it has quite a significance. Jerry, we'll go to the next slide. This is one of the few photographs, and please forgive the pixelization. This is a copy of an old book that also had a very fuzzy picture to begin with. But this is one of the very few pictures we have of the collection of herbs. And this is from a book on Buncombe County that came out in the early 1900s. And the reason it's shown is to give you a sense of the volume of just how much was collected. You need to visualize in your head essentially how this was a trade which dealt in great detail and great volume, but started with someone who picked one root or one plant or one leaf at a time and repeated that thousands of times in order to collect the kind of commodities that people were demanding for their pharmaceuticals of the day. North Carolina had been an herb collecting state since the late 1700s. In particular, there were people across the mountains who were known to be ginseng collectors. Daniel Boone, for example, was known to have tried to import some ginseng from Kentucky to Virginia at one time during his life. And ginseng made a very remarkable marketing trade in the early 1800s because one, once it's picked, properly dried and preserved, as long as it stays dry, it will stay forever. And so marketing is long distance from North Carolina as far as Philadelphia is an easy way to visualize just how important this trade was. As far as we know, there was no central repository for the way in which the market for herb trading existed in the early 1800s. As far as we can tell, there were special collectors who went to market towns with their goods, but we don't know too much about the details of where and how they sold what their wares were. Our first actual herb trader we know about was a gentleman named Calvin Coles from Wilkes County, who opened the first actual store business for herbs in the late 1840s and was actually one of the largest herb traders in the United States by the 1850s. Mr. Coles ran a store where the town of Elkin is today. It was called Elkville at that time. And he was trading with commodity brokers all across the North. One of his principal customers were the Shakers. He, in fact, sold herbs and roots and berries to 5 different Shaker utopian communities during the 1850s. One scholar who has studied Mr. Coles has estimated that he may have traded as many as 15 tons of commodities with these people up north over the course of about 5 years during the 1850s. He essentially was trading the standard sort of stuff, which would have made him quite an income in terms of how the market worked at that time. Mr. Coles would continue to market herbs during the 1860s, but after the Civil War, he became involved in Republican politics, and he became the head of the Federal Mint in Charlotte. If you've been to the Mint Museum in Charlotte, you might remember there was once a Federal Mint there for North Carolina's gold supplies. Mr. Coles' son, Arthur, opened a store on the Blue Ridge, and he continued to be a herb trader well into the 1880s and perhaps into the 1890s, and was an example of just how widespread this commodity was for people who were doing the trade. Jerry, we'll go to the next slide. Now, my focus is upon one particular business, and that is the business of the Wallace brothers in Statesville. This is Statesville, a picture taken about 1900, and it simply serves as a guide to remind you that this was a trade which grew by exponential bounds after the Civil War, because Statesville, like many places, became a railroad town. Once you had the railroad and you could ship things on time with predictability, particularly you could send mail or telegrams guaranteeing that the supplies would come through within a specified time, you began to see a rapid growth of how fast this trade could be. And you began to involve more and more people in the collection and the preservation of the various commodities. Jerry will go on. The people that I studied were German Jews who came to the United States in the 1850s from Hesse-Kassel. They involved a sort of extended family that was focused upon two brothers named Wallace, Isaac, and David, who had various partners, including Samuel Witkowski, who became one of the great merchants of Charlotte, as well as the gentleman you see here in this slide. If you look at the lower right side, Louis Elias, he was a brother-in-law of the Wallaces, and there was a fourth partner named Jacob Rentals, who was there for a while. All of this trade was like business was conducted in that day. You needed partnerships and you needed relationships to make the whole thing work, as I will go into in just a few minutes once I tell you about the Wallaces. If you can see the slide well, you will see that it says, "Dear friends, I have had about 12 inquiries for dried apples and cabbage." And he talks then about selling them. And what essentially that the Wallaces and others like them were attempting to do is that they were attempting to go to a place where the railroad met the mountains. I'll say that again, where the railroad met the mountains, because they knew that there was something called the mountain trade, which could be productive for anyone, particularly if they could ship in large quantities back to any kind of port or any kind of city that was a center of commerce. The mountain trade, as it was called, generally focused on apples, cabbage, chestnuts. I'll remind you of the proficiency of the chestnut tree before 1900, and other commodities such as herbs. You often found up to 50 wagons at a time going to cities like Statesville and Hickory, and in some cases Salisbury, where they were trading their mountain goods that they had collected all year for store-bought goods, if you will, that they were able to get using a commodity trade. This was a kind of sophisticated bartering, as you're going to see when I show you one of the documents with the Wallaces and how they conducted it. Keep in mind that much of this trade was cashless. It did not depend upon cash, and we'll come back to that as well. Jerry, if we'll go to the next slide. The Wallaces came first to Augusta, Georgia about 1851. They then opened a small store in Smoke, South Carolina, that's near Orangeburg, and they operated there until the Panic of 1857, I think, did their business in, because they reappear in the next year in Statesville, which at the time was what you called a railhead. That meant the terminus of the Western North Carolina Railroad stopped there. And so they opened a general goods store. They often called it a cash store, meaning that they would discount people if they had cash to buy things. And they were basically general merchandise merchants at this time. There is no evidence that they had anything to do with the herb trade before the 1870s. But they weather the Civil War. Their store is damaged when the North comes through town in 1865, and they have a rough time recovering from the Civil War because they need credit from their Charleston associates. They, at one point, abandon Statesville, go back to Charleston, then somehow they reestablish their credit relations, and by 1868, they have become rapidly the largest merchants in Statesville. In fact, by my estimates, they account for about a quarter of the business in that whole town. By 1871, they have decided to go into the herb trade. And that turns out to be both bad timing and a brilliant idea at the same time. I have to now explain about something called the Panic of 1873, which hit the nation, was extremely desperate times for business and cash flow. And the Wallaces almost went under, but they've survived it. And somehow, using credit that I can't find in their records where they did, they were able more than most to come out of the recession and be able to essentially start to buy herbs in great detail, in great volume, about 1874. They started a depot, an actual storage facility for the herbs they were buying in 1871. They seem to have completed it by 1873. And by 1876, they had become famous statewide. So they had a rapid rise in terms of what their business was and how the volume of their business was rapidly moving them forward. Jerry, we'll go to the next slide. One of the ways they made money, and they made money rapidly, and they made it in great volume, was blackberries. This is an actual business inquiry. This is the back of a page of someone who's making an order with them in 1879. What is blackberries worth? They seemed to endlessly get postcards and small notes, which essentially kept them in touch with what eventually I figured out were more than 280, I'll say that number again, 280 merchants, country merchants across the mountains of North Carolina. You'll see a map about the area later. But one of the very first things they were collecting was blackberries. What did you do with them? You dried them. I want everyone to visualize in your mind that if you pick a blackberry and it dries up, the way you see a blackberry on a bush, say in August or even September if it survived, is that they look like little bug doo-doos or bug dung compared to what a blackberry looks like. And the Wallaces shipped dried blackberries across to Chicago, where wholesalers there sold them to merchants across the West, particularly places like Montana and Colorado, because blackberries can be rehydrated like most dried fruit and can actually be used in things such as, we would call it, trail mix. And so they were shipping as many as a dozen boxcars. I'll say that again, not boxes, but railroad boxcars. So I want you to imagine a dried blackberry being barely a speck on your fingernail and thinking of how many of those it takes to fill one railroad boxcar, and they were shipping as fast as they could. At one point in the 1880s, Statesville touted itself as the second largest blackberry producer in the United States. Knoxville, Tennessee was said to be number one. And so they had, you must understand, the Wallaces dealt in every kind of commodity they could make a profit on. Herbs become their most famous product, but they took everything. Rags, they dealt a little bit in cotton, although Statesville was not growing cotton yet at that time. And my father even talked about the fact that in the 1920s and 30s, when he was young, the Wallaces, who were still around and in business, would take rabbit skins. So if you name it, they were interested in the products that they could, in a sense, send to an industrializing nation for reprocessing. Jerry, we'll go to the next one. The network of merchants that we found when we found the company records 20 years ago was extensive. This is simply one good example, and this is the Hyams brothers, and we will talk about the Hyams family when we get to the final part of the talk today. But notice they're way up in the mountains at Bakersville, and they are also at a place called Red Hill. Using what little business records I could find, basically the years 1879 to 1881, I counted, as I said, over 280 different people who did businesses with the Wallaces as merchants. So I need to, at this time, explain to you exactly how this worked. Once they began to buy roots, berries, stems, leaves, any commodity which had a marketing value, they put out notices to these merchants. My assumption is that they worked by word of mouth. And they worked by postcard, believe it or not. I found a collection of postcards, which they were sending out to the various merchants to tell them exactly what was being sold at that time and what the market conditions were. And the way it worked was very simple. The Wallaces had both a retail operation and a wholesale operation for manufactured goods. You will see here an indigo colored fabric that they call dark blue that they were having made in a local cotton mill just for themselves to market across the mountains. The Wallaces essentially provided these country merchants with store-bought goods. Think of pins, think of needles. You're going to see in a minute something about a banjo. They provided whatever folks wanted, and they could get to them using wagons mostly to deliver this, because the bulk of the 280 merchants did not live near a railroad. And the Wallaces would send out these supplies on credit to these merchants. The merchants would then turn around and they would sell these goods in the stores, and their customers paid for them in crude drugs. I'll let that sink in, that they paid for them in crude drugs based upon the weight of the commodity and the current market price, which the Wallaces quoted. So you need to understand there is a lot of venture capital going on here without cash. There is a lot of, shall we say, risk taking because of the nature of the market and the changes of prices as you laboriously take these commodities across hill and vale to the places like Bakersville. And so essentially what the merchants then did, they were put in charge of gathering these commodities by type, such as pennyroyal, we'll say, or blue cohosh. They had to somehow in their store keep them in something called root sacks. How they kept them all apart is not known. We don't have those details. And then when they had full sacks, the wagon from the merchant would return to Statesville with sacks of commodities. They could include blackberries. They could include feathers. They could include beeswax. It was any kind of commodity which this merchant could essentially collect and credit his customer. In other words, in their books, they would credit essentially a kind of barter system. And then the Wallaces would effectively send it back. The Wallaces would effectively credit them with the current value of the herbs, and accounts would be balanced over and over again. And the wagon would return to the country full of the commodities that were asked for. Jerry, we'll go to the next one. Now, this is the herb warehouse. This is the frontal part, the two-story part, is the one I think they built in 1871. And the back part, which is 3 stories with cupola, is the one which they completed, I think, about 1888, somewhere in that vicinity. This is the place where they stored them, sorted them, and essentially graded them as they went along. We can't find anything about whether there were grades of goods, premium, or mediocre, as you would grade cotton, for example. It appears as if that commodities were generally just stored as one kind. Now keep in mind, if this was blue cohosh, or this was Adam and Eve root, one of the commodities which the Wallaces dealt in, you had somebody in that building who knew which herb went in which stall or which box or which sack, and they had to keep them together and keep them proper, and they had to keep them without, shall we say, their deteriorating. Visitors talked about this place, that it had, quote, a pleasant and peculiar odor. And in fact, the Wallaces were extremely happy that it seemed to be daily that they had visitors who came just to see what this was about. This was such an unusual business, and the smell was so attractive, as well as in some cases, I suspect, repulsive, that people were thronging the place all the time. Adjacent to this building, we have no illustrations, was a demonstration garden where essentially they were showing how they could grow these things and which plants were which. Because in many cases, the visitors who came wanted to find out how to do it, because this had become a source of income for people who were, once again, relatively cashless and not as able to market their old mountain products as they had before the war. And so one of the things that we find is essentially that this was a place that people from a whole range of the Western, or I should say Northwestern North Carolina, came to. Jerry, we'll go to the next one. We'll be with you in a minute.
Let my computer froze. Hang on just a second.
I'll just talk a minute until you do it. This depot lasted until the 1940s. Now, if you will look in the top right corner, this is from a Sanborn map from the 1890s. You will see the Wallace brothers wholesale dry goods. They had become so involved in this trade that they gave up the retail sales. And they literally had a storehouse, as you see, with notions, storage and notions, etc., that they ran. By the way, if you notice on the right next to them, it says U.S. Internal Revenue Office, second floor. Statesville was also the center of the IRS that monitored the making of alcohol. In fact, other Jews in Statesville were some of the biggest brandy makers in North Carolina. There were more than 100 distilleries within 30 miles north and west of Statesville. It was also the center of liquor making, if you will, at the same place that they were selling herbs. If you look in the lower left, you will see what it calls the root house. And that is the building, that is the two-story building that you saw. Then do you notice over to the left, it says gardens. And look how much space that took up. That's a city block. And if by my estimate, at least half of a block was devoted to the actual demonstration of the various commodities that they were teaching people how to pick, grow, process, etc. Go to the next one, Jerry. By the way, the building, the general merchandise building on the upper left is still around. This is from the 1884 catalog. And this just gives you, if you will scan up and down, if you'll look with me, particularly in the S's, they tried to sell anything anyone wanted. And they would do their best to locate it somewhere in the Southern Appalachians or somewhere else. I'm still unclear as to where they got Saul palmetto berries that you see at the top of the middle column, but they obviously were marketing things which weren't just local. But go down with me, if you will, the S column, which is in the middle: Scarlet Pimpernel, Scotch Broom, Scouring Rush, Skullcap, Seneca Southern, Senna America, See America Senna. In other words, they were so particular about the exact stuff. Skunk cabbage root, no fibers. Skunk cabbage root with fibers. Slippery elm bark, thin. I don't know if they sold thick or not. It doesn't say. Smallpox plant. I have no idea what that is, except obviously it was used to treat smallpox. And then one, of course, the biggest things is snake root from Canada, wild ginger. And then my favorite of all the commodities in there, more than 2,000 names in this catalog, is sneezeweed. And it's unclear to me whether sneezeweed, since I'm not a scientist, if it caused you to sneeze or if it kept you from sneezing. I'm going to guess the latter. Go on down a little more. Soapwort leaves, soapwort root, Solomon's seal, one of their largest sellers, sourwood bark, spearmint herb, which obviously you could find in various ways or grow. spanker root, spotted pipes, I can't even say that, Pipesua, squall vine ordinary, and squall vine select. Now, if this bewilders you, and it bewilders me every time I look at it, somebody somewhere had to be able to recognize what they were picking. And here we come into the environmental study, if you will, of this talk, and we'll talk about it for another 5 to 10 minutes, if you will. But essentially, these were things which were beyond the knowledge of all but a few people in the mountains who may have known how to pick 10 or 12 or maybe 20 different kinds of plants for their own remedies. But this had become an incredibly complex business in terms of gathering all these commodities, in part because the Wallaces operated upon the principle, if you needed it, we'll find it, we'll pick it, we'll process it, we'll ship it. And they would do so on the promise of future sales, meaning in the future, you will make sure you get this commodity to make the kind of medicine, such as perhaps over here on the right side where it says wild cherry bark. You can think about it with coughing, which I've avoided so far, by the way. And you essentially see that there is an incredible amount of skill involved here. That's where we must bring in Mordecai Hyams, Hyams, who was the Wallace brothers botanist. So for just a few minutes, I don't have a photograph of Mr. Hyams. So we're going to use this as our background to learn about the man who was central to the success of the entire process. Mr. Hyams was a native of the Charleston area. He had belonged to the Charleston Jewish community, and he went, according to his testimony, to the University of South Carolina, where he fell in love with botany. He went to Florida for a while, where he married and taught school, and apparently began to be a botanical collector. When the American Civil War came along, he enlisted, was soon discharged, and was reassigned to the botanical warehouse, which existed in Charlotte, to essentially collect herbs for medicinal purposes for the Confederate Army. And Hyams was put in charge of finding the herbs. There is a record in Calvin Coles, remember him as the herb trader. There is a record of him during the Civil War selling something to M. Howard of Charlotte. My suspicion is he was doing business with Mordecai Hyams during the war, and Hyams was in Wilkesboro and other places trying to locate the kind of wares and other kind of berries, etc., that he needed for the Confederate war effort. After the war, Hyams moved to Wilkesboro. There is some indication that he worked for Calvin Coles for a while, but in 1869, he moved to Statesville and became an herb trader with a Statesville firm. When the Wallaces went into the herb trade sometime around 1870, 1871, they hired Hyams, and Hyams became central to the business for the next 20 years. He was the man who went door to door in the mountains to enlist people to be collectors. I want everyone to imagine that he said at one point when he was interviewed in the 1880s that he covered an area of 30 counties. And he did two things. He went looking for the plants themselves. We'll talk at the end today about how there was one in particular he found. And he also went into neighborhoods and communities, and he trained both the country merchants. See, the country merchant had to know what he was buying, or he could get taken. You could take regular grass and put it in a bag and sell it to him as skullcap, for example. So he had to train the merchant to know what to recognize to buy, and then perhaps, my suspicion is perhaps, he worked through the merchant to find steady customers of people who would do the collecting. And so what we see is that he was central to the entire process. Along the way, he became a practicing botanist, and he helped expand North Carolina's knowledge of its plant variety. Just within a few years of his opening the part of his business, he essentially increased our knowledge of North Carolina plants by almost 200 species. So he was a collector, he was a knowledgeable person, and he took specimens back to Statesville to grow in that garden. It's unclear to me who managed the garden, but it clearly was successful. And he is the one who essentially put it together for the various collectors and merchants. Jerry, we'll go to the next one. Just to pick one of the herbs, if I recall right, I think this is ginseng, but I'm not the scientist, so we're going to hurry on. Let's go to the next one. I wouldn't know ginseng if I walked up on it. This is one of our most valued artifacts of the Wallaces. One of the things this process had to do was make change. And so what the Wallaces did essentially was print their own money. The only ones I've ever seen, and there are specimens that get around now, are 1-cent ones that essentially you could balance your accounts to make sure that everything came out to the nearest penny. I actually own an original that one of the Wallace family members shared with me years ago, and they are quite lovely. But essentially, this is technically, if you didn't know, this is called scrip, and scrip was an actual use of money during the Gilded Age. Some cotton mills actually printed scrip as well. Jerry, we'll go to the next one. I know we're getting close to time for questions. This is the end of their catalogs. So if you will look at the top right with me, it says, our arrangements for furnishing green roots and herbs packed in alcoholic fluid in barrels for transporting by railroad or packed loosely in bags by express is now complete. In other words, this is the way in which they were improving the business as they went into the 1880s. We have also made arrangements for furnishing college cabinets and herbariums with specimens of all our indigenous plants, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the point where I need to let you know that these guys became internationally famous. In 1876, Mordecai Hyams put together the heart of the North Carolina exhibit at the National Centennial Fair, which was held in Philadelphia. He sent more than 400 plant specimens, more than 200 wood specimens, and more than 100 moss specimens. That became one of the highlights of the whole exhibit. He was so popular at that fair that he was asked to send a similar collection to the Paris exposition in 1878. The Wallaces also at one time got an award from a Berlin exhibition, and they were able to supply herbs and other specimens to both the Smithsonian Institute, which they sent, and to Harvard Museum, the Harvard University Museum. I tried my best back in the 1990s to track down those specimens, thinking it would be such a great find, but no one has been able to locate them in that way. So please go ahead, Jerry. We're going to the next one. We're about to questions, I think. This is my favorite business record of the entire thing. Send us a banjo. The Hyams brothers had essentially said, we're sending you roots. This is what he said in 1879. Produce shipped you this day. Place amount to my credit and do the best you can for me. Please send by return express 11 yards navy dress goods, 2 yards goods suitable for trimming, 2 yards fringe. If not the above goods, send something near it. And then in another one, he said in 1879, I send you feathers, wool, wax, Seneca, and ginseng will follow soon. Send us the banjo. And so you get a sense of just how extensive the commodities, which were going back and forth on train cars and wagons, were at this period. Let's head on, Jerry. I know we're getting time. This is the area that I found, counting the merchants that they serviced. I did not find merchants to their south and east. I can't guarantee you that stuff didn't come from Charlotte, but I never found any record of it. but this gives you a sense of the old Northwest and just how far their extent it was. I also found some things in Virginia and Tennessee as well. Let's go on. Who were the customers? Well, the customers in very simplest terms were the leading pharmaceuticals of the world at that time. They shipped to London, they shipped to Paris. This is one of the more famous, the Parke-Davis company. As you can see here, they are corresponding with them in 1879. They were sending commodities. And remember, they were sending them in great quantities. These were sacks at a time or half tons at a time. And these were being used to process the kind of, shall we say, patent medicines and other medicines of that day. Let's head on. The Wallaces were prominent in the community. This is one of their houses. We'll go on. I want to get to questions. This is Isaac Wallace. I've never seen a picture of David. They were active in the community. They invested in hotels, mills. They built the first suburb in Statesville, and I actually grew up right next to something called Wallace Springs Road, which came straight out of their suburb near Statesville. Next, Jerry. Because they were so prosperous and because 20 other Jewish merchants came to Statesville to trade, they were able by the 1890s to build their own synagogue. They also set up their own Jewish cemetery, which is still a regional Jewish cemetery even today. And this is where they worshiped. Their first rabbi was imported from New York City, and they were able to essentially maintain a very viable community. One of my greatest product moments is that in the 1990s, I did a program about these guys at the synagogue, and I was made an honorary Jew in Statesville. So and I was raised Presbyterian, in case you didn't know. Let's go on, Jerry. There was one other herbarium. This is Mr. Pincus. I know very little about it, but it gives you a sense of the fact of how central this was to the area. There were herb traders in Lenore. The folks in Hickory took herbs. And there were, by 1900, of course, competitors in Wilkesboro and Boone, most famously the Wilcox Drug Company, which would become very important in the 1900s. Jerry will go ahead and finish. These are Wallaces of later generations. The Wallaces continued to be prominent in Statesville through the 1970s. The last of their businesses was in the Wallace Jewelry Company, where they kept some of the old specimen jars, which now exist, and we're going to show you those in just a little bit. One more, I think, and we'll get to questions. This was the last of their herb warehouses. They went bankrupt several times because of the intricacies of their day, but they always were reorganizing. And you will notice R.T. Greer was the last of the herb traders in Statesville. This business lasted until the 1970s. Lastly, I think I have a catalog. Right to that? Yes, we'll stop here. And I think I'm ready. Let's see, we have 10 more minutes. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
All right, let's go to questions.
Okay, we have a few in the chat. One question is, I wonder what the most popular traded herb was during the 1840s.
Oh, every time the answer is always ginseng. Ginseng was the moneymaker because it was guaranteed to be sold to China. And the people who study the herb trade nationally, I'm not one of them, will attest to the fact that year in and year out, you made your money off ginseng and everybody else was more of a marginal business. Keep in mind the Wallace model, however, was if it could be collected, it could be sold, and we'll try anything. That was one of the things that, we'll make I think that their script is emblematic of their business. They made money a penny at a time. And we're very proud of that fact because that allowed people across the mountains to try to make their pennies by collecting things through the woods.
And I know that ginseng continues to be in such high demand that it is a tightly controlled natural commodity now. Some collecting is permitted, but on a very tightly controlled manner.
Other scholars have pointed out that by the early 1900s, ginseng had become relatively scarce, and they were beginning to attempt to cultivate it as well as find it thing. Mr. Hyams, I suspect, was extremely strict on trying to make sure that his pickers practiced conservation. But if there were 280 merchants, and let's just say there were 10 collectors per merchant, you're talking about somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,000 to 3,000 collectors of these commodities, and I suspect their skill levels vary dramatically. By the way, women were often the pickers, but we don't have the data for it.
Here's another question. Since they were in such a center of the distilling industry, did they make tinctures as well as dry raw medicines in Statesville?
I can't find anything about that. I wished I knew the answer. I don't know, but they were associated with other Jewish firms who were essentially the collectors of alcohol that were made in distilleries across the region. Just to give you an example, in 1890, there were 46 distilleries in Iredell County, and there were approximately 50 distilleries in Caldwell County, approximately 20 in Alexander County. I don't know the Wilkes County number, but we're talking about hundreds of distillers who were bringing alcohol to be marketed through Statesville. But I have no evidence that they were patent medicine makers themselves.
Okay. From Matthew Blaker, amazing variety of vitamins and herbs. Question is, the 1800s being very different, what was the hemp scene or trade like in the 1800s? Very different laws and handling at that time.
Never have run across hemp, and I don't own the catalog. And back then, when I did the research in the 1990s, I guess I was naive and didn't think about it. I don't remember if they list hemp at all. My suspicion is they do not, because hemp was grown in other states like Missouri, and it was being marketed for ropes and other kinds of commodities. I can find no connections to hemp at all. And of course, for those who are my age, one of the things, of course, that Wilkes County was noted for in the 1970s was its marijuana fields.
Here's another question about ginseng. Did they grow the ginseng anywhere else in the U.S.?
Yes, ginseng is found all across the Southern Appalachians. There is a whole literature about ginseng. You can look it up online. You find it in the north, you find it in the south, you find it wherever you have dense forest and the right kind of environment. But ginseng could be found everywhere. What North Carolina's claim to fame was the variety of the kinds of things that could be found in a small area. And ginseng was simply the biggest moneymaker.
Here's a question. Did they include any mushrooms or fungi among the herbs? I didn't
Never seen anything about mushrooms. Nothing. It's not in the catalogs, and I've never read anything about mushrooms being part of anything. Excellent question.
Were there any? Yeah, it is. Were there any references to Native Americans being involved in the business?
By that time, there were no concentrations of American Indians in the northwestern section of the state. I have read vaguely about Cherokee continuing, of course, their traditions of medicine, but I've never run across anyone who was a customer or anyone who was a collector for the Wallaces, which is what I study, that had any kind of American Indian connection. I don't know that answer. That would possibly involve studying it in Asheville, because there were some herb traders in Asheville at that time.
A couple more comments here. This brings to mind the modern day poaching of ginseng and other plants. Do we know anything about how this historic trade could have contributed to modern plant rarities?
Oh, I can refer to the research of a scholar named Luke, let me get his name, Luc Mangette, Manget. If the person would like to Google him, Luke Manget, who studies this in terms of the impact upon the environment in the North Carolina mountains. I think I found his article at the North Carolina Herbarium website. I think that's right. And he talks about the fact that by the early 1900s, there were so many herb traders across the mountains and there were so many collectors that they were beginning to find scarcity of these commodities. This was one of those times, basically, when industrialization took a surplus and turned it into a scarcity. He also points out that it was the heavy timbering of the mountains, where basically they cut down all the trees, and he points out the death of the chestnut trees in the early 1900s, which altered the environment of the mountains and, in a sense, changed the habitat that many of these plants had normally thrived in. So you don't have the same, shall we say, abundance of finding this anywhere you looked back then. I think we live in a very different world in terms of where the plants are now.
I'm going to read one more comment in the chat. This story has similarities to the Moses and Caesar Cone story, founders of Cone Mills in Greensboro and the Cone Estates on the Parkway in Blowing Rock. So sounds very similar to their history.
The first time the Wallaces went bankrupt, the creditors were the Cones.
Okay, that makes sense.
They had associations with everyone had associations to the Cones. The Cones had their fingers throughout the Piedmont and the mountains.
And we are at 12:58 right now, so you wanted to say a little bit more about the Hyams. You want to take just a few minutes to talk about them?
If the audience will allow, let's show your other slides. Let's go to the next one. Mordecai Hyams and his sons became famous. This is Shortia, right?
That's correct. This is the plant, and then this is the flower. This is
known as Hyams's or sparkling Shortia. It has a Latin name that I cannot pronounce. Jerry, can you pronounce Galicifolia?
That's pretty good. Shortia galicifolia.
Okay.
I'll go with that.
And this is a plant which had been discovered by André Michaux, the French botanist who went through the southern Appalachians in the late 1700s. It had never been seen again. He had kept a specimen of it. And Asa Gray, who was the first great American botanist at Harvard, this is Michaux, this is Gray, had put out basically the great quest. Where did Michaux find this rare plant, and how could we find it again? Well, the Hyamses essentially scoured the mountains. And in 1878, on the banks of the Catawba River near Marion, they saw on a hillside the flowering of what became known as Hyams's or sparkling Shortia. They took a specimen of it, not knowing what it was, sent it to some other botanists, and it eventually led to Asa Gray making a pilgrimage to the herbarium in Statesville, and the Hyams's family taking him to the spot in Marion where they had found it. Now, one thing I want to say about this story is, how did Hyams remember the spot? Part of the great mystery to me is, how could he go back? He collected thousands of plants, and he somehow could identify this spot on a hillside along the river. We'll go to the next one, Jerry. So he became internationally famous because he had, in a sense, found it. And this is essentially one of the botanies. You will notice Bulletin of Popular Information of the Arnold Arboretum, and this is part of the story. It is itself a story, and you can look it up online. Professor Troyer, I think it is, from NC State, who was a botanist, tells this story in an article that you can access online. Beyond my scientific expertise. I believe we have the jar specimens last, is that right?
Yes.
Yes. And here you are. They kept specimens. They survived. I saw some of them in the Wallace jewelry store years ago. The herbarium at UNC Chapel Hill says that it has over 60 specimens that Mordecai Hyams collected. I've run across articles about these collections being in Raleigh back in the 1960s. But aside from the things that we have today, I don't know what survives. I really wish I could find out what Harvard has. It would be quite the finding. Any other questions?
And let me see. I think that covered most of the questions that I'm seeing right now. And I just will follow up that these are jars that we have in the museum. I think we have about 20 that actually have the Wallace Brothers label on them. We have another 40 that are very similar that have more generic labels on them. And the information that I had on this collection of jars is that we know at least these were shown in the 1904 Louisiana Purchase Exposition. And again, I suspect that these were reused at many expositions using these specimens provided by the Wallace Brothers to tout the natural bounty that North Carolina has as a commodity. So really interesting history.
And a wonderful local story if you grew up with it.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank everyone who attended, and I'll turn it over to Jerry.
Well, I just want to thank you, Dr. Freeze, so much for joining us today on this Lunchtime Discovery Series today and sharing this remarkable story. I was mesmerized by the story, I don't know, 25 years ago. I'm not sure when I first heard you talk about it. So I really wanted to share this with a broader audience. And so I'm so glad you accepted the invitation to talk about this. And a lot of people don't know this history. A lot of the botanists don't know this history, and it's such a neat history. And I had a connection with the Hyams in that I worked at Discovery Place for 20 years. That's why I was living up in Iredell County. And my direct boss was the executive director of Discovery Place, Frida Hyams Nicholson. She's a direct descendant of this Hyams family. So I had that
They moved to
connection.
Charlotte, and parts of them moved to Charlotte.
Right.
And
anyway, I just want to thank
the descendants of these folks are incredibly proud of their contribution to North Carolina history.
Yeah. And again, just a remarkable story. If you have more questions, then just email them to us. I'm sure Dr. Freeze would be glad to perhaps answer some questions too by email or however. I want to thank you, the viewers, today for watching and also sharing some of your questions and comments with us today. We will be back next week with another edition of the program on the North Carolina Bird Atlas. So please tune in next Wednesday if you can. Remember to follow the Office of Environmental Education on Facebook and Twitter, and also their website at eenorthcarolina.org. And of course, follow the museum on social media at Natural Sciences and see other upcoming programs on our website. So again, thank you so much. Until next week, please take care, and we'll see you on another time. Bye.